Bonjour. Hello. Welcome very much to our panel. We're just making our way up the stairs to please have a seat. Thank you so much for being with us. The point of this panel is to look at these many crises that we're facing. I am Melissa Bell. I'm CNN's correspondent here in Paris. We've been taking part in this event for the last 3 years, and it seems to me that every time we come, the idea of this conference, which is that multilateralism can bring solutions, seems threatened still by further divisions. But here we are. And what my panel all have in common today is that they represent supranational entities that continue to try and deal with these challenges with the idea that multilateralism can work and that solutions can be found. And so we're going to explore that with you today. We're very grateful for having you all here. I'm just going to introduce my panel. First of all, to my left immediately, of course, Audrey Azoulay, who's the Director General of UNESCO. We're delighted to have you with us. Josep Borrell-Fontelles as well. Thank you so much for being here. You are the European High Representative for Foreign Affairs, of course, and the Vice President of the European Commission. Matthias Cormann is the Secretary General of the OECD. Gargi Ghosh represents the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we're joined down the line by Rebecca Greenspan, who's the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. I wanted to start by, before we head into these many crises, of course, global warming, the debt crisis, the food crisis, everything worsened, of course, by the war in Ukraine. For each of you perhaps to give us an idea of what you think the priority is, because we're looking at these multi-crises, we're looking at a world where you can get lost for looking at all the divisions there are, but what you believe needs to be tackled first. Perhaps, Matthias, I could start with you. I know that at the OECD, it's global warming that you made a priority. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, there are, as you say, a whole series of challenges in front of us, and some of them are longer term and structural, and some of them are causing short-term pressures. But I mean, what all of these challenges have in common is that better global cooperation and a globally more coherent, better coordinated approach will help us be more effective, and that is particularly true when it comes to climate change. I mean, climate change is the ultimate global challenge. We're all in it together. Countries around the world are increasing their ambition and their commitments, but in the end, we need to ensure that every effort in individual jurisdictions helps to solve the overall problem and doesn't just shift the problem into other parts of the world. And in that context, just going back to Ukraine, I mean, what is the first priority? I mean, at the moment, a just peace in Ukraine as soon as possible would be good for the global economy, and it would also be good for multilateralism, because right now, the fact that we have Russia's unjustifiable illegal war of aggression going on, it makes it very difficult to work as well as we could otherwise through fora like the G20, for example. And I mean, I think number one priority at so many levels right now is a just peace in Ukraine as soon as possible.
Josep Borrell, perhaps to you, there is the threat to global cooperation that the war in Ukraine has represented, but it has for the European Union also been a catalyst for coming together.
Seeing as we're in Paris, I'll be speaking French. Thank you. Yes, of course, the war in Ukraine has had a massive impact and was in fact a wake-up call. The European Union is not an international organization. It is a grouping of states that have decided to work together. Now, first of all, to achieve peace, which was done, and second, to have an impact on the rest of the world in order to smoothen inevitable geopolitical competition and find solutions to major global problems. Of course, the war in Ukraine made that all the more difficult because tensions shot up, tensions between East and West, and it was more difficult for countries of the South to achieve economic development. The energy prices, food prices, inflation, rising interest rates, and a likely debt crisis. All of that affected developing and emerging countries, which rightly are saying that they have played no part in this war but are suffering the consequences. What we need to do, first of all, is to help them face up to the multi-crisis and also emphasize on the causes of the crisis. The cause of the crisis is not the sanctions against Ukraine, against Russia. It is the war in and of itself. Gas is being used as a weapon of war by Vladimir Putin. The food crisis is due to Ukraine not being able to export its foodstuffs. And so the first thing to do is to help countries that have suffered the most to tackle this crisis, and we're doing that in many ways. And second, to assume our geopolitical responsibilities. And we did that. For the first time, the EU stepped in to provide military support to Ukraine. We are trying to achieve energy independence from Russia. We gave Ukraine the status of candidate country. Ukraine will have a place within Europe, and that will change the geopolitical map of Europe. And we want to be able to define a new security structure in Europe to replace the Helsinki Agreement structure. Now, indeed, the question of solidarity, I did want to ask Gargi about it too, but before that, Audrey Azoulay, listening to what Matthias and Joseph Borrell have just said, talking about the immediate priorities, people who are hungry, people who are cold, countries in crisis and don't have the means to tackle them, and a diversity of crises, how can we think long-term? As well. Thank you very much. Yes, these are questions that we have to grapple with at UNESCO. I represent a UN organization, a multilateral organization in its very essence, which was born following the mother of all crises, the Second World War. After the moral, physical disaster, the devastation caused by the Second World War, the question was your very question. How do we continue to think long-term? How do we ensure that the human dimension is at the heart of our actions by anchoring peace in the minds of men and women? And that is what we do through culture, science, education. How do we ensure that our short-term actions contribute to peace in the long run? And when we go through crises, be they major conflicts or the climate crisis, which indeed exerts a lot of pressure on our societies, the question is, of course, responding to an emergency, and we have humanitarian agencies within the UN systems, the UN system that do that, but it's also about thinking long-term, and that is also a part of our work. It's incredibly difficult. Multilateral cooperation is becoming increasingly challenging in the context of war such as the one we see unfolding today in Europe. But we're lucky enough to have champions of multilateralism. The EU is a major partner for UNESCO and has supported us in our work. I want to mention a few examples to show how the short term and the long run work together. The first example, and it's important not to forget, because we're still going through an education crisis that began during the pandemic. Overnight, children were no longer going to school. 1.5 billion children in the world who could no longer go to school. And so perhaps in the short run, it was important to close schools and focus on health issues, and that is what happened. But as we learned more from science and as things changed, at UNESCO we did two things. First of all, we supported states in implementing implementing remote learning systems, and multilateralism played a role there because companies, states, NGOs, media outlets, internet providers, all of them came together to enable remote learning as much as possible, although it was challenging. But at the same time, we had to think long term. And things moved very quickly. The idea was to reopen schools as early as possible because there were a lot of gaps in education as a result of online learning. And also thinking more broadly about what 21st century education might look like in the context of 21st century challenges. And so whatever we undertake in the short term needs to be done with the long run in mind and consider the human dimension, which is at the very core of UNESCO's work: culture, education, science. They all need to be a part of the international community's response following crises and through the crisis. That's also what we're doing in Ukraine to help support culture in many ways. And in Iraq as well, in Mosul, a city that was devastated by war, by ISIS's occupation. And UNESCO, with the support of the international community, launched a major undertaking to rebuild the city's heritage, the great Al-Nouri mosque that ISIS had taken over, but also churches, historic homes. And we also worked on improving education, on teacher training, on training for peace and heritage-related training. So it's important to think long-term and keep humanity in mind.
On the question of education, we're talking about the nature of these crises, these overlapping crises, the difficulties for supranational organizations or foundations like yours to deal with such multifaceted crises all at once. But on that question of, for instance, education, the words of the UN Sustainable Development Goals report of 2022, which makes pretty grim reading, that years of progress on things like giving access to education for all, healthcare, is years of progress on eradicating poverty, hunger, improving healthcare, education, providing basic services that have been wiped out. How do you compensate for that? How do you even start on a national, individual level of helping countries on these basic necessities that were perhaps already, even before these crises, a challenge?
Okay, pour commencer, merci de m'avoir invité.
First, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to attend this event with you in Paris. Last time it was virtual.
So, you know, for us as a foundation, we're an international foundation, but we're not a supranational organization. We're non-governmental. And so when we look at this panoply of crises, the question for us is, what can we do to help? And where do we start? And I think the SDGs is very much the inspiration for us now, just as it has been for the past many years. In 2015, when the world came together around the SDGs, they were already ambitious, but they were a commitment to solidarity. And if there was ever a time when we need that, I would say it's now. So we are very much inspired by the Secretary General, who calls on all of us to recommit to the SDGs and put those at the forefront. As we think about those, there are three areas that I think are particularly important or urgent for us. First, food security. The numbers of people who are verging on acute food security all the way to famine are incredible. It's tragic, and we cannot continue with development and progress with that dimension of hunger. So food security is a top priority for us. Second, we need to mobilize additional resources for development. And it's a difficult time for all governments to do that. So the proposals being championed now to unlock additional resources from the multilateral system through SDRs, through debt relief, are super important. And finally, I think we can't move on until we've learned some of the lessons of the pandemic and put in place some protections, disease monitoring, rapid response, that will help prevent a future epidemic, which we know will happen, from becoming a pandemic on the scale that has set us back so many years on the SDGs.
Thank you so much. I'd like also to turn to you, Rebecca Grinspan. You're joining us from Geneva. Thank you so much for being with us. You represent, of course, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And just picking up on what Gargi was just saying about the question of hunger, because, of course, we've moved right back to that essential, fundamental priority for the world at this stage, the question of solidarity and the fact that people are finding it as a result of what's been happening in Ukraine harder to feed themselves. And I think you can talk to us a little bit about what's being done specifically with that in mind to try and get, for instance, on a very concrete level, the grain moving out of Ukrainian ports.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. So thank you for having me, even in this remote mode. Let me first say that, as you said, food insecurity has tripled in 3 years in the world, from 135 million people in 2019 to 345 million today, according to FAO and WFP numbers. So what we are seeing here is the effects of this cascading crisis. Yes, cascading crisis because of COVID-19, because of climate change, and now because of food insecurity and very high prices in food, energy, fertilizers that are affecting very much the prospects for the future. So in Istanbul, with the leadership of the Secretary General, we signed 2 agreements. Yes, one to open up the Black Sea Grain Initiative for the exports of food from Ukraine, and also to make the unimpeded exports of food and fertilizers from the Russian Federation according to the exceptions that were already embedded in the sanctions regime in the EU and the US. For the moment, more than 10 million tons of food have left Ukrainian ports, 10 million tons. That has meant bringing down prices at the global level in more than 16%. The index of the Food Agriculture Organization on food has gone down 7 months in a row. And this is the most important effect of what we have done, because if we lower prices, then we make the food that is inexistent accessible to the families and the households in the world. According to the Global Crisis Response Group, when we made our first analysis, 90 countries, 1.6 billion people were in a vulnerable situation because of the high prices of food, energy, and fertilizers. So bringing prices down was an essential step to ease the pain on the developing world and on these very vulnerable houses. Now, there is still, a road to be traveled, because now we are very worried. First, to continue on this trend, to maintain the Black Sea Grain Initiative open and extended after the deadline in the next days. Also to bring to avoid the next crisis, that is the crisis of fertilizers. So the problem now is that smallholders in the world are being priced out by the high prices of fertilizers. So that will affect not only wheat and corn, but it will affect rice. And now we are in the sowing season in the Northern Hemisphere. So our main task today is to be able to bring down the prices of fertilizers and to avoid that a crisis of affordability today will be a next crisis of availability of food if we don't tackle this problem. So all our efforts have been concentrated today by extending the Black Sea Grain Initiative that has been no doubt a success and that really has the support of all the countries across the board, by also avoiding a crisis of fertilizers, the fertilizers crunch crisis, so we can avoid a crisis of availability in the future. And our efforts have been concentrated on that part.
Matthias Cormann, perhaps to you, listening to Rebecca then and Joseph Orl, then to you as well, you are like, it is a very specific area that they've targeted, hugely necessary to a huge part of the world. No one but a UN agency could have the level of being above the fray and being able to bring Ukraine and Russia together in order to get this very important agreement through. And yet it's also a reminder of the limits, as we were just hearing there, the difficulty as this war goes on. And there is this divide geopolitically in the world of getting so much more than dealing with the urgency done. Matthias, perhaps to you, and then to Joseph Borrell.
Well, I mean, look, there's certainly so much more than the urgency to be dealt with. I mean, clearly, I mean, there's an increasingly urgent and very important climate challenge. There's a challenge to make sure that we manage the digital transformation in a way that optimizes all of the benefits, but also better addresses some of the associated risks and disruptions, in particular for people. You know, there were trade tensions and geopolitical tensions rising before the war in Ukraine. You know, our rules-based international system was under pressure before the war in Ukraine, and there certainly is a significant body of work to be done to ensure that all together we can address the evolving global challenges of our time, working together effectively. And I mean, that is certainly something that from the OECD point of view, we are trying to help to facilitate. I mean, we are a platform that helps countries learn from each other's successes and failures by providing a significant body of comparative analysis and data and information out there. But we also provide a platform for dialogue. And I mean, one of the issues which we believe is one of the great success stories of international cooperation is the work that was done involving 140 countries in our inclusive framework on international tax reform, to reform international tax arrangements to make them fairer and work better in the context of a globalized, increasingly globalized and digitalized world economy, to make sure that big companies pay their fair share of tax in the markets in which they generate profits. Now, people might not think it's a very sexy issue, but governments around the world need to be able to fund the essential public services that their people expect. And there's many countries around the world that are facing significant challenges on that front, and making sure that our international tax arrangements are more fit for purpose for 21st century, we believe was an important challenge, and that is one where the OECD was able to make a difference. And we believe that something similar needs to happen when it comes to the international approach to carbon mitigation, from carbon pricing to non-price-based carbon mitigation measures. There's a whole diversity of approaches that are being pursued around the world. How can we make that into a globally better coordinated, more coherent approach to ensure we get to carbon neutrality as soon as possible, but no later than 2050, in a way that is effective and fair?
Joseph Borrell, as long as the G20 is as divided as it is with Russia, all of these issues, perhaps not the emergency, but issues that need to be addressed, are not going to be, the world is not going to be able to address them.
Yes, look, thank you, Rebecca, for your explanations. And I think that the first thing I have to do is to thank the United Nations and Rebecca and the Secretary General in particular, and also Turkey for the effort to deblock the grain export from Ukraine. I jumped to English, but let's go back to French. Oui, c'est vrai.
Yes, indeed.
Merci.
Thank you.
Vous avez réussi
You succeeded in opening up their support for cereals to leave Ukraine, or grains to leave Ukraine rather. But what is the deep-running issue? This is not a natural disaster. Why is grain not leaving Ukraine? Was there a disaster, a storm? No.
de la nourriture comme une arme de guerre.
Food has been used and is being used as a tool for a weapon of war. Russians blocked the grains leaving and prevented them from leaving Ukraine. So we're saying we found a solution. Russians, we need to find a solution to Russians using grains as a weapon of war. We need to say this loud and clear. Russians prevented grains from being exported out of Ukraine. And if the crisis has not been as severe as it could have been, it's because we Europeans, through solidarity and through land and the ports of the Black Sea, managed to have these grains leave Ukraine. Otherwise, the crisis would have been deeper. So we need to be thankful that we found a solution, but we also need to be to say loud and clear, pinpoint loud and clear who are those who were responsible for this problem. This didn't happen in a haphazard way. Second, we need to deal with a more pressing issue, more serious issue. Somebody who's running the risk of dying of hunger, we cannot ask that person to be concerned with climate change in 20 years down the line. This person is trying to figure out how to live in the next 20 days, not 20 years. So we need to deal with the food crisis, not the energy crisis. Fertilizers. Why are we speaking about fertilizers? Well, because they're being blocked. That's the first reason. And the second reason is because fertilizers are being produced using gas. And the gas prices are rising. Why? Again, likewise, for the same reason. Russia cut the gas supply. And so Europe has to look for other sources of gas. And so the market is quite tense and prices are skyrocketing. So once again, one must pinpoint the culprit for this situation. And of course, the United Nations is doing its utmost to apply sanctions so that they can have an impact while not impacting markets too much. And we're helping them in this respect. And I'd like to take this opportunity today to say this clearly. European sanctions do not have an impact either on food or fertilizers. No economic operator could claim any consequence on him or her if he takes part in the fertilizer and food program of Russia, because that economic player will not be impacted by the international sanctions. Audrey Azoulay, you remind us of all the scope of these challenges. What we did with this initiative, the Black Sea Initiative needed an agreement, required an agreement between two countries, and we also need to take a stance on what's happening in Ukraine, the injustice of it all. And this reminds us of the challenge for all the organizations that are involved in tackling this emergency, trying to keep their head above water while managing the impacts for global humanity by also having a firm stance. When international rule of law and peace was challenged, well, I think the answer should be twofold. First, the world cannot have the luxury of choosing between the short and the long term. We must tackle both terms. There are emergencies that are of the immediate term that we need to tackle, such as the war in Ukraine. We need to share the burden of and the work, but there's also international communities' role when it comes to being involved in longer-term issues. If we forget the longer term, it will come back to our. We will be reminded rather of the long term. Forget it. History shows us that human mind is such that we sacrifice the longer term for the shorter term. However, today we no longer have this luxury. Therefore, we need to truly be able to reconcile both. And so what you said is quite accurate, in fact. Within the UN system, the multilateral system, we need to remind ourselves of one thing first. We're not just speaking here of a single technique for cooperation. It is a set of values, a charter, a set of rules and regulations that are quite clear, and that means that we won't trample upon rules and regulations. Multilateralism means that when values are thwarted, then it is up to the UN system to speak up about it and to denounce that. And I think this was done clearly during this crisis. and it must be the same approach for all crises. Likewise, we also need to work on the longer term and ensure that the entire world remains mobilized on our common large-scale challenges, for which we need to find common solutions. So, in fact, our societies are increasingly intertwined, and we are sharing increasingly common issues and challenges. At the same time, this multilateral cooperation based on human rights is being undermined. In the recent experience I've had at UNESCO, which is an experience that gives me some reason to hope and to believe that we can always move forward, is when such multilateralism based on values includes civil society, not states cooperating between themselves, but intergovernmental organizations working together. We need public opinion, we need researchers, we need non-governmental organizations and businesses. All of these players will create a situation that will bring member states closer together. I'll quote an example. About perhaps 3 to 4 years ago, UNESCO decided to create a normative instrument to create a law on the ethics surrounding artificial intelligence. Yet within our member states, there are diverging viewpoints on the ethics of AI. So initially, we were told it will be very difficult, you'll never reach an agreement, or probably a minimal agreement, which was not what we wished for. And designing this instrument, how did we go about this? Well, using the input of researchers, academics, different societal groups and NGOs. It took a great deal of time to consult everyone, to develop ideas, but ultimately we were able to reach an ambitious agreement with 193 member states working on surveillance, transparency of algorithms, and the transparency between on issues relating to gender equality. And I think what also helped us was working together with civil society to build this instrument. So we shouldn't pit in states against each other, but really ensure all this movement is working together.
Foundations like yours play such an important role. There's been, these last few years, a huge development of the role of non-state actors, even as the world was becoming more fragmented, as we've been discussing. That puts foundations like yours in a very particular position to be allowed to bridge those gaps that Audrey was talking about.
I hope so. We can't do our work without strong partners, both on the government side and the civil society side. We rely on that system. But just to very much agree with Audrey's point that we have to work on both the short and the long term at once. To give you some examples, in the past couple of months, we've made commitments of about $1.5 billion to food security. In the very near term, we'll support nutrition, emergency food, but we are also investing, providing grant resources to support research to help smallholder farmers in Africa build resilience to climate change. The reality of the food crisis today is that it is made infinitely worse by the Russia-Ukraine war, but it was also the result of several seasons of poor harvests caused in part by climate change. And so today we have this moment of extreme crisis. It's not just a food crisis, but a nutrition crisis, because we know for families who spend huge amounts of their income on food, at this moment they're already substituting nutritious food, dairy, livestock, vegetables, for staples. And that loss of nutrition, particularly in young children, we know has an effect on cognitive development throughout their lifetime. So if we care about making this just a temporary crisis and not a generational one, investing in nutrition is super important. Our role as a foundation is, to provide rapid resources to invest in scaling up production of ready-to-use therapeutic foods, in providing grant resources to fortify foods, but we rely on governments to enforce fortification, on distribution systems in the private sector to get food out. So we're a small part of the puzzle. And on the medium-term side, we know that farming techniques, livestock management techniques need to be adapted to operate to be just as productive in a chaotic climate. Maize, for example, is very vulnerable to changes in temperature. How do we are supporting, in this case, African institutions to work with smallholder farmers to strengthen the ability of farmers to know weather patterns through digital techniques in advance, to know how to adapt their farming approaches in different kinds of weather conditions. So this is where we can bring some concessional resources that have some risk tolerance, can move quickly into the picture, but very much depend on the government systems and private sector systems around us.
Rebecca, perhaps to you now. We've been talking, of course, about the food crisis, but it is a triple crisis. There's a food crisis, an energy crisis, a debt crisis, all at once, with the climate emergency, and the world trying to deal with all of that and the fallout of all these events that tend to make governments want to get more introspective and dealing within their own borders with their own emergencies, at a time when the supply chains, the world's ability to work together is threatened. What hope do you see for us all from the point of view of the United Nations? You've given us a very concrete example of an important agreement that was made in a very concrete sense for so many people. But looking ahead, how do you keep hope in the idea that there is more possibility to keep working together when these very threats tend to threaten also our very ability to do that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. But I would stress that when we started trying to broke these agreements, nobody believed in us. It was so hard. Every step of the way was so hard. And look where we are now. Yes, with 10 million tons of grain having left the Ukrainian ports, prices going down. According to the model of the World Bank, maybe we have prevented another 100 million people coming into food insecurity. So, this is a ray of hope for multilateralism, for, trying diplomacy and the dialogue can make breakthroughs even in the most difficult situation of a war, because we made it happen within a war going on. So we should believe that leadership, perseverance, working together, we have worked with the EU, with the UK, with the US in trying to make it happening. We have broke a deal with Ukraine and Russia that are at war. We saw in the Security Council the really, across the border support for these efforts to continue. So this is multilateralism at its best, despite a very difficult situation, because the truth is that cascading crises mean cascading inequalities. This is about the vulnerable people in the world that have nothing left to be able to cope alone with these problems. And I want to take something that Gaji Ghosh said before. We have to be able to tackle this crisis not one by one, because the financial crisis will also be probably a cause, and I think that Joseph Borrell said this before, a cause for a debt crisis, for a financial crisis in the country. And that this will bring back the food insecurity crisis there. So we need to tackle food, but we need to tackle the financial crisis, the debt crisis that we have in the world. We need prices going down, but also liquidity for these countries go up. And the G20 is a very important opportunity to press, to put forward some of the solutions that we have been talking about the SDRs, about the emergency windows, about the multilateral development banks coming more strongly to the plate to help the countries make the investments and make this long-term and short-term starting at the same time, a question that Audrey have brought to the table. This is the only way. The G20 is a great opportunity, again, for multilateral efforts, for coordinating efforts to bring solutions to the most vulnerable very quickly, because we really need it.
Matthias, perhaps to you.
No, just look, I also want to agree with the point that we need to deal both with the short-term and the longer-term challenges at the same time. But we've got to deal with the shorter-term challenges in a way that doesn't make it harder for us to achieve our longer-term objectives. And I guess the risk often is when you're faced with short-term pressures is that countries can go for the knee-jerk reaction. And when it comes to food security, for example, I mean, when the most important thing in a way that we can do to ensure that we can get food to where it is most needed is to keep markets open. Yet some countries will think that maybe export restrictions are a good idea, but export restrictions, to the extent that there's a food security problem, will make the problem worse because it reduces the available supply to go around. Now, when it comes to higher energy prices and the energy crisis we're facing at the moment, we really need to respond to it in a way now that helps us optimize the green energy transformation that we need, and not in a way that makes it harder for us to ultimately get there. When it comes to providing support to low-income households to help cushion the impact of high inflation, we need to do that in a way that is as cost-efficient as possible by making sure it's well-targeted and temporary and doesn't make the debt sustainability problem worse. But often when faced with short-term pressures, governments will sort of, I guess, in a political sense, be tempted to respond in a very political way when we need to continue to remain focused on what our medium to long-term objectives and structural objectives actually need to be.
I think the lessons from the European Union, Josep Borrell, have been particularly in this regard interesting these last few years. I think it was Jean Moulin who had said that the EU would be born of its crises, and so it's proven so far. The pandemic had tested European cohesion. In fact, it came out more cohesive still from the pandemic in terms of dealing with vaccines and so on. Similarly, Ukraine, as you mentioned earlier, threatened to divide it along an east-west axis. It's come out in terms of your brief, stronger than it had been before. But the energy crisis threatens Europe in a way perhaps that Europe had not imagined being threatened in at this time last year. Are you confident that this is a winter that Europe can weather with its solidarity and its unity intact?
Yes, je suis absolument convaincu.
Yes, I'm absolutely convinced that the EU will remain united and that we will be able to deal with the energy crisis with positive results. We became reliant on Russian energy to a massive extent. 40% of our energy imports came from Russia. We thought that Putin would be a reliable supplier, and that was probably wishful thinking. But that 40% has come down to 7%. Now only 7% of our energy imports are from Russia. And if we manage, and we will, to free ourselves of that reliance, that will completely change our relationship with Putin. And Putin thought that we would not be able to do what we have in fact achieved. And I think that this was a major demonstration of Europe's political will and ability to mobilize its economic and political resources to help Ukraine. And that brings me to, of course, the question of funding, to the basic question, that is. Today, we are witnessing a growing bipolarity with the US on one side and China on the other. Meanwhile, multipolarity is also a reality. We are living in a multipolar world, and these various poles are not willing to submit to the leadership of one party or the other. The relationship between the East and the West is very tense, and there's a widening gap between the North and the South as well. And so the EU, as a geopolitical power, not just as a club for trade, needs to step in the medium run in order to ensure that competition on an international scale should not impede on cooperation to solve global problems, because indeed competition exists, but it should not prevent effective cooperation, because without cooperation, how can we hope to solve problems like climate change? China is using as much coal as the rest of the world put together. And so how can we make progress on climate change without China? We can't. Climate change is the backdrop, and against that backdrop, we saw war strike. Look at Somalia. In Somalia, people are being displaced because of climate change. It did not rain this year, and neither will it rain next year. Is that a short-term problem? No, it is a structural problem. And then, of course, we have grain blocked in Ukraine, which caused a massive humanitarian crisis. And I think we need to pay careful attention to the way in which countries of the global South see these problems. We need a significant political effort, not just an economic effort. We are the largest contributor to development aid. We are a major contributor to climate change adaptation, and that is important, but we need to do more on the political front. We need to ensure that these gaps between the North and the South do not deepen. Otherwise, we will be incapable of finding any solution to these challenges. And that is what I refer to as geopolitical Europe. That is to say, after having achieved peace among European countries, we need to ensure that geopolitical conflicts outside of Europe do not prevent us from finding solutions to global challenges. This is a question for Rebecca and Audrey. So this global order emerged from a desire to solve global problems in a more cohesive and united way, and that cohesion has never been as much under threat as it is today. So do you still harbor any hope that this crisis, this immediate crisis in Ukraine, will be able to be overcome, and then we will be able to bridge the gap between North and South? Well, what is for certain is that regardless of the crises, the tensions, the competition between states, what we have been building since 1945 through the United Nations in its various forms, well, all of that is a common heritage, common to all of our states, which remains useful in spite of crises, or at other times too, because it offers other ways of cooperating or engaging in dialogue in situations where it's not possible to engage in bilateral and regional dialogue. And through that heritage that the United nations represent, we can find platforms for dialogue and cooperation. For instance, we're all familiar with the situation between North and South Korea. Well, North and South Korea turned to UNESCO to safeguard their tangible and intangible heritage that they have in common because they couldn't do it in a bilateral fashion. Another example comes from Jordan, where we have a piece of high-tech equipment that has been commissioned since 2018, where researchers and various countries from the Middle East have come together to work on this project, and some of these countries do not have bilateral relations, and thanks to science, thanks to the United Nations, they can come together and cooperate. So in spite of tensions and despite divides, it is possible to work together on issues that are of common concern to us all. But I also believe that it is our responsibility, including the UN's responsibility, to come up with new governance mechanisms for some issues, shared issues on which we need to consider state sovereignty, but at the same time, we're so interconnected that we need to be creative, and some regional organizations do that when they tackle some issues collectively. That's what we're trying to do for biodiversity. And to give you an example, some countries here today, we are building a marine corridor with Costa Rica, Ecuador, Panama, and Colombia. So it is a mechanism to protect the biosphere under UNESCO's biosphere program. So it is a cross-border initiative, and states are sovereign and fully committed. So we too need to be creative and find solutions that are better aligned with 21st century challenges, even though our governance mechanisms are older.
Rebecca, than on the question of trade and development, that the world has functioned in a certain way, countries have their own mechanisms, their own habits, their own reflexes. How important, picking up on what Audrey was just saying, is innovation, taking an innovative approach? I mean, the grain was a perfect example of something that seemed improbable and was profoundly innovative. But are there other examples? Do you think that is your role at this stage, is to find new and different ways in which the world can cooperate on these issues that will be crucial to fixing all of the crises we've been talking about today?
Absolutely, Melissa. Absolutely. I do agree with Audrey. I think that is very important. We have to find the ways, the niche, the spaces for diplomacy, for solidarity, for coordination. I think it's a good example because the disruptions in trade are a big part of what we are seeing in the crisis of food and fertilizers and energy. So we need to find the way to continue the one market, one economy, one set of rules that bring us together. Decoupling won't bring a more secure world, yes? And we have to find that possibility from happening. You know, two internets, two different rules for digital or artificial intelligence, two different rules for financial architecture. That won't bring the world together to a better place. So I don't believe that decoupling is the answer. We need to find the way in which we come together, where we find the spaces where we talk about it and decide for bringing, you know, the necessary instruments to the table. And I think that a very important part of this is to avoid the North-South divide. You know, the South really felt abandoned in climate change and in COVID with the vaccines, you know. So we need to avoid that they will continue to feel abandoned now in this crisis. We need to put the elements and the instruments. We have the instruments to be able to help the South, going through this crisis. And I won't understand if we don't take the actions that we have to take in the IMF, in the World Bank, in the G20. They are solutions that have been put forward for us to demonstrate that we can do this together, that we can coordinate. The examples that Azulay brought to us are very good examples. The ones that the UN have brought to the table are very good examples. We are all here trying to find the spaces, the niches, the innovative approaches that will allow for the world to stay together in a multipolar world. Yes, we are already in a multipolar world. The question is if this multipolarity will bring more multilateralism or less, more trade or less, more division or less. Multipolarity does not say it all. We still can work through these very geopolitical problems to try to bring more solidarity and more collective action to the table.
Gargi, perhaps to you, the idea who sees from the forefront and perhaps bottom up exactly those challenges in the global south that we're talking about, the immediate challenges, that sense that they need to feel heard at a time when perhaps the conversation is happening without them on many fronts.
Sure. So, in my role, I get to work with entrepreneurs, activists, teachers. So it's not hard to be optimistic in my job because, when I think about how we will confront these crises, be able to overcome sort of climate change, create productive food systems. You spend time with young activists in sub-Saharan Africa who are holding their governments to account for change. You spend time with women entrepreneurs in India who are starting sort of digital financial services lending in their women's cooperatives. That's clearly where better comes from. So for me, the question is, can the international system do what it needs to do to unleash the power of the people and the ideas, scientists talking to each other across boundaries. And I think the institutions that can keep up with the people and what people need will survive and thrive and be part of the future, and those who can't will not. And that I think is the challenge for all of us who operate at the international level in service of people.
I'd like to put a similar question to Matthias and Joseph Borrell, just before we finish, because we're running out of time fast. We started this panel with the idea that the world is facing so many different crises that are cascading, that are overlapping. It is not a promising picture. I'd like to ask you both very briefly, after everything we've heard and everything that's been said, how hopeful you are for the future of multilateralism to take us beyond these crises, so that at this time next year, there isn't yet another one that threatens that multilateralism itself.
Well, I'm an optimist, and yes, we're dealing with a whole series of challenges, but I do think we can get on top of them. We all live on one planet, and in the end, there's no alternative. Whenever there's a setback, we've just got to get up again and keep going, and we've got to keep talking, and we've got to keep trying to find the best possible solutions to the challenges of our time. There will be other challenges in the future, but in the end, we've got to keep trying to find the best possible ways to deal with the issues in front of us in the best possible way.
Joseph Borrell, we will come out stronger from all this in a year's time.
For the European Union, it's easy because multilateralism is at our core IND. We are multilaterals by essence, by definition. So we are very much in favor. And we don't want to be an example for anyone because we have also a lot of things to be blamed. But yes, we have a strong feeling, nous sommes convaincus que
We strongly believe that cooperation is the only way to resolve global challenges. We live in a world that is so interconnected. Challenges know no borders, and cooperation is the only way to tackle these challenges. Unfortunately, we are witnessing confrontation. Multilateralism is sometimes mentioned, but it's important also to note that there's a balance of power behind that multilateralism. We need a world that is much more attuned to challenges in parts of the world that requires support, but also recognition. And I think that's a word that we need to use increasingly, recognition for others. The EU was able to resolve tensions and confrontation, and I think we need to achieve that at the global level.
Well, thank you to all of you for taking part today, and to Rebecca for being with us à distance. We're very grateful. Thank you so much for being with us for this.